Well, I am so grateful to Larry Beasley for joining me here today for a conversation about the City of Vancouver. I'm trying to remember when we first met. Do you have any recollection?
It was many, many years ago.
I'm pretty sure it was in the early 90s.
It was.
Yeah, it was. And authored a wonderful book called Vancouverism.
And it is a book where I tried to document that very, very pivotal time in Vancouver's history between Expo 86 and the 2010 Olympic Games to say what we were doing when we were transforming the city, when we were putting the city, I think, in a position to be among the most sustainable, livable cities in the world. A small city over in the corner in the dark became a city that when I started working elsewhere in the world, people would say to me all the time, well, now tell me what you did about this. Tell me what you did about that. And I thought, well, I should write all that down. And unfortunately, none of my colleagues did. It was an effort, as you know, hundreds and hundreds of clever people, starting with the original team reform and then moving right forward from there. And no one had written about it, so I decided I would.
At the heart of all of it was the notion of the livable city. Can you describe what the livable city means to you and how that impacted your work?
The fundamental issue that we faced when I first started my practice in planning at the city under Ray Spaxman was that our neighborhoods were falling apart. People were going to the suburbs and our neighborhoods were in trouble right across the city. So the first principle that we tried to implement as aggressively as we could was the day-to-day enjoyment, fulfillment of your neighborhood. Second, we realized that with this landscape and the configuration of our region, that we had to protect a lot of our green, our natural environment, and that meant that we had to densify. We got right down to all the details. What's your community center like? What is the childcare like? Is it a safe street? Are the parks good? Are they connected? Are they safe? Is your neighborhood safe? And we developed denser areas based on a very brilliant plan that had been done a decade before by the region, the Livable Region Plan, so that we could densify, but it was sweet density. It was delicious density. People came to enjoy that. And the net effect was that particularly in Vancouver's inner city, because we had already protected neighborhoods and we were not going to go back and destabilize our neighborhoods after all that work and all those years of trauma. But the inner city was able to intensify. We protected the West End where there were 35,000 people in residence. We developed all new communities all around the core city, walkable to downtown workplaces. We did protect some downtown workplaces because we didn't want housing just to take over. And we created a place that drew people. So livability, again, was based on community. It was based on an intimate relationship with everything around you and your family, your friends, your neighbors. And it was based on the convenience of being able to get out of your car, those long commuter routes that so many people were doing, have walking as your main way of getting around, and then transit as a backup. So if you go to downtown Vancouver now, you will see something amazing. You will see people walking their children to school. And so we developed a massive agenda for housing families with children, which meant schools and all kinds of special community facilities. We had an officer whose only job was to look at everything we're doing and saying, that's not going to be suitable for families with children or for children. And then we, of course, discovered if you design something for children, it'll work for everyone.
It did work, but the emphasis was in large part on community-based planning and engaging the community in that planning process. There seems to be some perception that communities are against densification, but your experience was that they just want to be involved in shaping that through the lens of housing and mobility and community amenities, green space, as you described.
Yeah, I would go back even a step upstream from that. In my opinion, it is an ethical requirement to engage with citizens face to face, moment to moment, over and over again, in many different ways, in order to understand the city that they want. And what I discovered is that when you get into that intimate relationship with tens of thousands of citizens, you learn there is a way. For decades, they were choosing not to live in our cities all over Canada because people were, without consulting them, plopping down density. They were destroying neighborhoods. They were doing all the kind of things that the last generation almost enjoyed because they had this philosophy that they were trying to implement. But they forgot you need citizens, and you need them not just once. You don't need them just over a web. You don't need them just in a meeting or an open house. You need their hearts. And it took us back to neighborhoods because that was the frame, the scale, I'll say, at which you can have a conversation. You know, a conversation can get too big. It gets too grand, and most people start to tune out. But when you talk their neighborhood, you've got their attention and you keep their attention. And that's why when we were dealing with densification, and Ann McAfee, my colleague, is co-director of planning with me, brilliantly, when we realized that we also had to bring the densities up a bit in those neighborhoods that we had protected those years before, she said yes, and we will do it by going out in each neighborhood, and we will talk with people, and she discovered, and she only got through a few neighborhoods before her time was up and my time was up, but she discovered that yes, there's plenty of open-mindedness once you have a conversation. But you try to lay something on people? No.
Well, I contrast that with the mindset at City Hall today, which is very different. And I can tell you, having sat through hundreds of public hearings over the course of this term, that the neighborhoods and the residents do not feel heard as things are changing. And moreover, the narrative that's coming through loud and clear these days is, you're all a bunch of NIMBYs.
First thing I would respond to what you've said, I know there's worries, big worries in this city about people's involvement, about people feeling marginalized. First thing I would say to anyone in our profession, my profession of planning, is drop the word NIMBYism. Using it allows you to marginalize those people, allows you to put them aside. And I want to tell you a story. It comes from your father's generation. And that was when planning almost had to be removed from government because planners of that generation went into communities, they wiped communities out in the interest of whatever it was. They went in and they said, these are messy houses.
Urban renewal.
It's called urban renewal. And it led to a time in this province where the provincial government was almost about to ban planning. Citizens were saying, that's just not acceptable. A community person saw their family. They saw their friends. They saw their favorite places. If you go in goodwill and you help people understand the demand that's out there and the young people that need housing, and you talk to others, they make room. They did it in Ann McAfee's process over 3 or 4 different neighborhoods. They made room. Those neighborhoods were getting more intense and open-minded. What I'm trying to say in all of these examples is, I don't care who's in power. There's one thing that every political party, in my opinion, has to embrace in this town in order to get us back on track. And that is, you must, in every case, engage with the community at an intimate, detailed, and deep level, And you have to find the answers with those communities. And until you do, you have to be careful.
What you're describing to me is a managed development process, managed within the community, within the neighborhoods. What we're seeing today is a growth promotion process. 2010, so a little after that you'd left, CACs and developer contributions became regularized as a revenue stream on the capital budget. And this is a concern to me because the city, 50% of the capital budget is now funded through developer contributions. So I'd like to understand from you, what was the genesis of this, starting with where did the CACs come from in the first place? And can you describe a little bit from your experience how that came into being?
Well, yeah, I'll do that. But first, I just want to set the stage. We are a country of immigration. We are a country where, in the world, we're an attractive country. I call us a sanctuary society. But the principles of how to grow, the moment we give that up, then we are going to despoil this very thing that is so appealing to the rest of the world. CACs is a good illustration of this. I was among the early people working under Ray Spaxman who helped to, in a sense, codify how we would handle CACs. Earlier on, as you know, in every rezoning, there was, well, what do you need? And there's a principle, by the way, just so you know. You must judge that the new zoning is equal or better to the existing zoning. And that principle opens up the genuine inquiry about, okay, if you want to densify, is that equal or better to what's there? Well, let's look at the facilities. Let's look at the services. Let's look at the parks. Let's look at every aspect. Let's look at neighborliness. Let's look at urban design. And you make that judgment. When we made that judgment, we had a problem. And the problem was we discovered all of the limitations and problems. We had no funding source. And so we looked at that fairly casual relationship in rezonings, and we said, let's try to really apply that to the problems that come with densification. So the way we handled every rezoning, and I'm telling you this, there was no exception. First led by Ray Spaxman, and Ann and I carried it on. We would first do an urban design assessment. And we'd say, okay, how does that fit in? Does it fit in? Can it fit in? And many times we found, yes, it can fit in. We regularized, we put standards in place for public amenities. We analyzed and we said, okay, there's a shortage. And we would literally do financial analysis called a pro forma. And we would say, okay, this is how much money you're making. We'd like a piece of that, not all of it, because then no development happens. People need profits. Then here's how much we need for the community side. And that worked beautifully for years. There's a key to this, though. You can't put it in general revenue. You can't say it's a source to meet your other budget obligations. You can't do that because it has to be applied to the mitigation in the particular circumstance that you've identified in that rezoning.
Can you give us a couple of examples of CACs done properly?
Yeah, I can give you the biggest example of all, which is False Creek North. 205 acres developed in the inner city, where that developer paid huge CACs. He did it in two ways. He did it in money. He had to pay money for things that would be built in that community, and he did it through in-kind contributions. And I did a post-occupancy evaluation when I left the city. I was no longer involved with the city, with my students at UBC, and it determined that 90% of the residents there, at the highest density in the city, are absolutely in love with that community. And they told us, yes, it has the childcare, it has the school, it has the community, wonderful community center, that has heritage buildings restored, and the train, and it has character, it has protection, pedestrian walkways, greenways, it has everything.
So let's contrast that with, for example, the Cambie Corridor Plan.
I could use the Cambie Corridor Plan. I'm a little I was a little more shocked. I'll use another example, and that was the Grandview planning process that went on a couple years ago, when the planning team did go out and they did work with the citizens, and the urban designers did work with the citizens. I know this as a fact. Came back with a plan, and home base told them to go back because it wasn't going to yield enough community amenity contributions, as I was told. I didn't hear it. I wasn't in any of the meetings. I was gone by then. But that's explicitly what I was told by a number of different people. And of course, that destabilized the community accord that had been achieved. Why did they do that? They needed more money for general revenue, I guess. And that is a perfect example of where CACs have gone wrong. And so this funding source that every intelligent citizen should see as an absolute essential in their community to invest in the future of their community is now one that they don't want.
Now, you know, with this Broadway plan that's got the debate and decision today, is that it will supersede all of the existing community plans along the Broadway corridor.
I have had engagement with the team that's working on the Broadway plan, not over the whole plan, but in one area that I have some particular interest in, which is far, far to the east of the plan. And that team has been working really hard. They have been struggling. There's not enough of them. They've been working during a time of pandemic. But I think the net effect is that a couple of agenda items important to the city, densification being the main one, to deal with growth, and transit-oriented development, which is a logical thing when you've invested, billions into a transit system. Those two objectives seem to have overwhelmed all other objectives. But I always assumed it would be done through a community planning, a neighborhood planning process. Is there a way out of this situation now? I would say there is one way, one very simple way that might give some surety to the tens of thousands of people that I think are upset. And that would be to say, we adopt this in principle, transit-oriented development, intensification of our city to deal with affordability. But in every case, we're going back over the next 3 years, and we're going to do a community planning program in each of those areas to determine how it happens, what needs to happen with it in terms of amenities and supports and all that, and where maybe it shouldn't happen.
But there seems to have been a mindset change. I mean, my experience now is that residents are impediments or obstacles to the goals of the city, which are, again, driving growth. The paradigm seems to be promoting growth to extract revenue to fund what they now characterize as council priorities.
I have heard many people say that they are feeling marginalized, that they are feeling pushed aside. That's the essential contradiction that is unacceptable. We did have leadership that came in from another part of the world that didn't really understand the long, long tradition of neighborhood-based engagement. We did have almost everyone in my generation retire all at the same time within 5 years, who were committed in their heart and souls to engagement. And you can talk to any one of them. They'll tell you exactly what I just said. We did have, for the first time, this explosive problem of affordability that hit us like I had never seen it before, starting in about 2009 or so. And we did have an awfully lot of young people that came in, well-educated, the most well-meaning people in the world who were trying to cope with what they saw as an impossible thing. And when that happens, you know it and I know it, because we fought 2 wars based on it, that you just go to the fastest way forward.
So back when Anne was your co-director of planning, she was really the driving force behind City Plan. And the idea was that we knit them together into a citywide plan. Back in 2020, in January, I started my 50 Neighborhoods project. Mm-hmm. where my objective was to go out to a different neighborhood at a very granular level every week and talk to the various different organizations, from childcare to seniors, from policing to BIAs, community organizations. What would the housing typologies look like? What would the impact be on mobility, community amenities, commercial and economic activity, and of course, green space in the context of what the nuance of what made that neighborhood unique. As we are now going to be moving into the Vancouver Plan process, which has largely been done during a pandemic, I'm concerned that, again, we're seeing the same approach of a top-down, this is what you're going to do, instead of listening to the people and developing the plans from the communities. Have you observed this, and can you comment on the impact of that to the future of the city?
If you look at Anne McAfee's process on the Vancouver Plan, you found two things that were really, really elegant. First is, she did the plan itself through a very intensive community engagement process. In fact, she even had a little committee of representatives from different neighborhoods to critique the whole thing, to keep it on track, to keep it online, because, you know, as a project manager, you're trying to push it to the finish line. I get that. But they engaged in all kinds of ways. They had community fairs, they did all kinds of things. And out of that came the second piece. And the second piece was, it was a highly conceptual plan. It was a highly conceptual vision. It didn't try to say, and you go look at that plan carefully, it didn't try to say, you've got to do this here and this there, and we've now had some conversations, so I don't care what anyone else says, that's what we're going to do. It said, in principle, this is the kind of city we're trying to create. And then it did a third thing. It empowered a neighborhood-based follow-up process that was to go into each neighborhood and say how we do it. I haven't watched the current city plan process, but unless it is doing both of those things very, very deeply and bringing those together, I worry about it.
I don't see that mindset at City Hall anymore. I'm sorry to say. Anne McAfee, when she talked about city plan back in the day, in the 90s, they engaged with 100,000 Vancouverites in various ways, in person, pre-internet. Now, again, this has been done during a pandemic primarily, and we are told that we've had, 10,000 touch points, hits on a website or surveys and things of that nature. To me, that doesn't constitute real community planning at all. And yet we're being told that is sufficient.
Until you can show evidence that there has not only been the engagement, but that the information flow has changed and resulted in a plan with high community support, you just have to go back to the drawing board. In many roles I play around the world, everyone is pushing hard to meet deadlines and all that, and there's urgencies. But smart cities understand that the pandemic, in the same way it caused us as individuals and families to have to change our lives, to have to pause, that's also true in government. Planners sometimes believe if they talk to you, they're okay in engagement. But the truth is, if they don't listen to you, it was as though they didn't talk to you. There is that obligation. To me, it's a moral obligation to just get to know people.
Have you heard that David Eby has suggested that the whole public hearing process on rezoning be removed from municipalities, and that because there is so much demand for new supply that there should be no impediments to producing it at the community level and at the public hearing level?
The rezoning process is the moment in time when everything we talk about becomes real to a time, a place, and a people, a group of people. And I have believed from my first day as a planner that that moment when you are required by law to have a public hearing is essentially a citizen's insurance that there will not be capricious government. That in the interest of this or that or the other, however good those interests may be, that I will have as a citizen in this place and this time on this proposition, I will have my say. The beauty of a very intelligent, engaging process that goes over a number of months is that the public hearing becomes less and less relevant, becomes less and less urgent.
Do you think there's a way of strengthening community representation so that the process that you've described can be preserved and strengthened in the city?
This will surprise you, I think. I have worked pretty intensely under both at-large systems and ward-based systems or constituency systems. When I was young in my career, I was a big advocate for a ward system because of the very things we've been talking about, and I thought it brought things down to the neighborhood. I'm no longer in favor of that. I believe an at-large system causes a local government to look at the whole thing and allows you as a politician to have a bigger perspective. But that system just doesn't work either unless there are these other levels in place to bring that decision making and that engagement down to the neighborhood level. One place I worked in particular in Dallas, Texas, which is a completely ward system, the hardest thing was to get a politician to realize there was a bigger picture. I couldn't do it. It was impossible. Maybe the mayor had that perspective, being elected at large, but those individual politicians were so driven by the individual issues of their ward, and not only that, they got very aggressive. Don't you talk about something that might be good for the city if it affects my ward. That worries me even more. So I'm saying from my experience in both those systems, just at a working level, the ward system has many, many flaws for me.
Two questions leading from that. Well, why is that not the case with the 8 MLAs across the city or the 8 members of parliament across the city? Why would you say that it's different there where they are representing a subset within the city but at the provincial or federal level?
It's a good question. I have a feeling, and I'm speculating, that the mission of provincial governance and the mission of federal governance forces any politician to take that wider view. But there is another thing, and it's organizational. The political parties do not condone, and you and I know this, widespread opposition within the party to where the party's going. And that helps to moderate that tendency towards just looking at my particular constituency. So, but at the level of local government, there's something very different. And what's different to me is that those local issues, when you're facing them yourself, are so fundamental to your absolute future. It's tomorrow my child doesn't have childcare. It's, there's not enough room in our library, that whatever those issues are, and they feel very real. And people will say, I don't care what else you do in the world, just fix that. And I've had a local politician say, I'm sorry, I just can't do anything.
So here's another one for you. Los Angeles has something called Empower LA with 99 elected volunteer community councils that then carry the will of their neighborhoods, as it were, up to the broadly elected council. There's another example of model. What I'm trying to do is find a way where people can be represented at the neighborhood level that is not going to have the negative consequences of the myopia that you're describing, because you need to be able to balance the neighborhood against the city. But right now, there is no focus on the neighborhoods. The ad hoc community organizations, like the Coalition of Vancouver Neighborhoods, for example, has 25 different neighborhood groups. They are disregarded. They're not taken seriously. In fact, they are seen as obstacles or impediments. So there has to be another path forward that can, again, back to that word balance the objectives of the broader city with that of the neighborhoods.
My experience of those is that the net effect tends to be a very strong executive, and so the democracy itself, while it might work at a moment-to-moment, bit-to-bit level, tends to go the way of the executive. I'm not sure that there is an organizational security for your concern. I agree with your concern. I think it's an ethical and philosophical commitment of every politician, first and foremost. Why? Because they felt the imperative of doing that. I did like their liaison alderman scenario because, not for them, because they were doing a pretty good job, I liked it for the citizens who could then say, well, I have Marguerite Ford to go to because she's my liaison alderman, I know that. It was more for the citizens to have a touch point. And I was very sorry when that was kind of abandoned. And it got abandoned, I don't know if you know this, but it got abandoned when there was a groundswell of, again, conversation about a ward system. And many politicians of the day said, well, that smells too much like a ward system, let's just get rid of it. Because they didn't want a ward system. So I think it's more a commitment of those who are in power, who are elected, to realize these two things have to be reconciled.
Years ago, I think back in 73, 74, my dad and Uncle Dave wrote an essay called Civic Governance, corporate, corporate, consultative, or participatory? And their argument was that the prior government back in the days of Gerald Sutton Brown was a corporatist model. Then the consultative model was really what they brought in under team. It could have even gone further to a more direct participatory model, but my observation is that it swung right back to a corporate model because I've said it many times and I'll say it again, residents are impediments or obstacles to the larger objectives. And I question what those larger objectives are, because the notion now is that the city should, under the guise of equity, should be one size fits all everywhere. And that would say that by definition, any kind of individual characteristics of neighborhoods should be abandoned in view of this larger, again, one size fits all equity approach.
And my reaction to that is that it's that philosophy that's wrong. It's not the organization. It's the philosophy that's wrong. One size does not fit all. When you densify one area, that's a very inequitable thing to people between areas. When you develop areas without developing facilities and services, that's inequitable. When you do rezonings and you don't use the community amenity contributions to solve the problems of that area, that's inequitable. The city is not organizationally equitable. What we try to do is make the process of government inclusive and equitable. We try to make the policy framework support and give special help to those who can't compete as easily in the marketplace. All of those things are not, in my opinion, organizational things. In fact, everywhere I work, I worry that someone thinks, well, I'll make an organizational fix and all will be well. It's a philosophical thing. And the way I think you handle that is every citizen in this coming election has to ask the philosophical question to everyone running for office. Are you in favor of wide public engagement, inclusiveness of engagement, or not? And we have to get, again, a council, a leadership that no one would say what you've been saying, that everyone would say they are inclusive, they are taking care, they are not marginalizing.
I'd like to switch gears to land inflation. One of my observations has been, I think I mentioned to you that I looked at the BC assessment property assessment roll. I'll use the decade between 2010 and 2020 as the example. In 2010, the land and the air above it, within our boundaries, University Endowment lands to Boundary Road, was valued under assessment at $188 billion. By 2019, actually, only 9 years later, it had gone to $480 billion. And when I talked to BC Assessment and said, well, to what do you attribute this exponential land inflation? What are the determining factors on that? A big part of it is highest and best use. So every time we rezone a piece of property, July 1st, BC Assessment come in and now assess it at highest and best use. So if we are actually inflating land values in excess of pace of change, looking at population growth as a determinant of that, how can we be, at the same time, do we need to dampen land inflation to get our affordability under control?
Well, there's a couple of reactions I have, and I'm not an expert on land valuation, so I'll say that for sure. First thing is, I think you have to look at this in a world terms, not just locally. I keep hearing that Vancouver is one of the most expensive places in the world. Then I go to London and I see apartments for $150 million. So Vancouver is an expensive place, but there is an inflation that's going on in cities around the world. I don't know any exceptions to this. To me, inflation first and foremost comes from more demand than supply in principle. Here's a city that 30 years ago was more or less not on the map in the world, and now it is a destination city in the world. So not just for people from other parts of the world, but also from people from other parts of our country. So we have, in my opinion, we have a huge demand that has to be dealt with. Even when you say you can do 4 units rather than 1, the land value then goes up to 4 units, even if you have no intention of doing more than one. And so what that means is that in this modern world, the allocation of development rights according to a predetermined plan is much more important than it ever was. And so in some areas, yes, you'll see land values escalate, managing growth in areas where you want it to happen, holding growth away from areas where you don't, or being very clear how much growth you'll take in those areas. That's number one. Number two is that for the first time, we're at a place where we have to have a strategy to secure development for middle-income people. Let's put our resources, our policy, as much to secure middle-income affordability as we do low-income affordability. So the first thing I would do, just so you know, is that I would as a policy, I would draw a line around every area that is delivering middle and lower affordability, and I would say this is precious. These areas are like gold. We're not going to set off inflation in those areas by approving one here and one there and maybe one over here. We're going to specifically preserve those areas. And then if people want to talk about intensification, diversification, yeah, we'll have a big community conversation and figure out how to do it. But it'll depend on saving that as much as we can of that existing housing. But it goes way further than that. It goes a commitment by the provincial government, the federal government, the city government, just in the same way that in my day we went and begged them for money for low-income housing. We have to do similar things now.
Totally agree that the other levels of government have to be integrally involved. But I do want to make the point that, again, over the decades, and again, since you left, there has been an enormous volume of rezoning, which has led to this exponential land inflation that has not been developed. It's the act of rezoning that leads to the exponential as opposed to incremental inflation. Yeah. So the argument that I'm trying to make is if we want to slow down the land inflation, we should stop the precipitous volume of rezoning and look at what we need to do to develop within our existing zoning, which is significant.
Well, there's two aspects for me. Number one, I have always been anxious about just ad hoc rezonings everywhere because of that inflationary thing that it does all around it. And I think instead you begin to say, here's how and when and under what condition. I absolutely do not think you can solve this for this city. You're not going to make this city the one city whose land values stay low and it's still an attractive city.
It's really a question of the rate of inflation.
It is. And you'll recall that the previous councils actually had policies where they would look in an area, and if they thought the rate of change in that case was too much, they would damper that. That was a short-term measure, probably a good measure as a short-term effort, again, to manage change. The more you say this, the more you say, we have to deal with growth, so we're just opening up this whole city to growth. The more you say that, the more you are going to feed into the inflationary potential.
All the major developers, West Bank, etc., they've got you go online and you see their digital showrooms, but they've got showrooms in Beijing, Shanghai, Dubai, around the world. And so there is a big, and has been, going back, post-Expo, with the north side of False Creek to a huge volume of offshore sales. And the observation is, with the inflationary impact that we've been talking about of all of this rezoning, is that it has just continued to widen the gap between global wealth and the local economy.
You can so kill it that you also kill our place in the international economy at the same time. Or you can say, I get that, that's the way the market's working, but I'm going to protect our citizens. And we're going to do it through things like essential worker housing, secure affordability up to $80,000 per household, public investment with private investment, nonprofit development companies. I could name you 20 ways to do this. Unfortunately, if you have a hammer, the nail looks like what you want to use, and government has laws, and so that's the hammer they're using. I believe that if governments can get more entrepreneurial about how to engage in that market process for the interests of up to middle class citizens, we'll make more headway.
Let's talk about the economy for a minute, because again, that plays into it. Up till Expo 86, I would say that the natural resource extraction industries were the dominant force in our local economy. When I was growing up, McMillan Bloedel was the biggest company in town. Yeah. Post-Expo, with the sale of the former Expo lands to Li Ka-shing and ultimately the Concord Pacific Development, we've seen a shift with the almost complete decline of our resource industries and their replacement in orders of magnitude by real estate, property development, and construction, which one could argue is a fundamentally unsustainable model. I'm interested in looking at what the future drivers of the local economy will be outside of things like tourism, which ultimately attracts low-wage jobs. We point to things like the technology industries and film and television industries, although we are really a back lot or a back office for American multinationals. Do you see the intersection of our housing and development policies and strategies and how we can be providing for the future economy without putting all our eggs in the real estate basket?
I believe that I believe this fundamentally, that our future does rest in the contemporary economies, technology, communications, all those. And I believe that those are economies that are particularly drawn to appealing places. Those are people that don't have to live in Baghdad. They don't have to live in places that are bad. They don't even have to live in London anymore if it's getting too outrageously costly or traffic is getting bad. And you'll hear the people talking about simple issues like that. I believe there's many, many factors that set this place up for the contemporary economies. I've believed that from all the way back in 1985, 86, when I too saw our traditional economy not collapsing, but just being globalized. And we were a minor player in that globalized economy. And I remember then saying, there's the only future for this place is just to be so appealing that new money, new energy, new people will want to come here as compared to many other places.
In conclusion, Larry, the future of the city from where we're sitting right now. If we can't afford to live here, what's the point? And despite what you've said on safety, I know if people are afraid to take the kids to the playground, we have a serious livability problem. And I don't know if you've driven down Water Street lately, but if we're not taking care of our potholes, our garbage pickup, our snow removal, these are the nuts and bolts of operating a city. And I think from all of the listening that I'm doing, those things are not being attended to. And moreover, the people aren't being listened to because there are other objectives.
And I want to really emphasize, and I think we talked about this before, I do believe that one of the fundamental blindnesses that's occurred in modern local governments here is that what I would call the suite of obligations that comes with being a local government, just accommodating the people who live here. What I think is the answer is very much in this next election. Every citizen has to look at the simple facts. Is the person they're going to vote for going to support getting back to making sure the basics are dealt with? Is the person they're voting for going to make sure that policy doesn't just happen on a polemical basis, but that it happens with the people, in a strong engagement with the people? Is that person going to be an agent to protect the interests? And is that person expressing themselves as a servant of the citizens? I'm going to ask those questions. And when I see those answers, I'm going to vote for those people. And I think if citizens did that, you would see a reset. And it would be a reset very much like your father saw, when citizens had just had enough.
Well, thank you, Larry, for coming here today to talk to me about these issues. I'm really hopeful that people will be thinking as we go into the next election about that reset. To me, it's existential. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.